Hello class, you need to understand the key points in the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the last few weeks, you would have learned about Kennedy, Castro, and Khrushchev's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, when you look back at this crisis, you have to first understand the significance of Cuba to the USA and why they needed to ensure that Cuba was always friendly to the United States. Once you understand the political and economic interests that the USA had in Cuba, you will be able to understand why this crisis so deeply affected the United States. In summary, you would have learned the three big factors that caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. Firstly, the tensions between USA and Cuba that greatly strained their relationship. This was mostly because of Castro's new policies that threatened American investment in the tobacco and sugar industry, the economic pressure that USA then placed on Cuba to ensure that it continued to have interests, making Cuba look elsewhere for new trading partners in the Soviet Union, and America's attempts to remove Castro from power in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. All of this led to Cuba feeling rather insecure and looking for new allies, which is what led to the second factor, Cuba's friendship and alliance with the USSR. By creating a trading alliance to buy Cuban sugar for Soviet oil, this led to the Cubans becoming much closer to the USSR economically and politically. The USA then realized that they now had a communist country at their doorstep. This led to the USSR looking to protect Cuba from USA's control. Finally, the USSR's decision to place the nuclear missiles in Cuba had a large role to play in causing the entire crisis. This trigger factor was led not just by protecting Cuba's security, but also by trying to create nuclear parity with the USA for the missiles that the USA had in Europe that were within minutes of reach to the USSR. So USSR had three big reasons for placing the missiles in Cuba. One, to close the missile gap. The USA had Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey, which were just able to reach Moscow within less than 10 minutes. The USSR needed an equally advantageous point to place their ballistic missiles, which is why Cuba became the prime target and the ideal ally. Second of all, the domestic politics in the USSR required Khrushchev to actually strengthen his political position. By creating such a strong signal and putting missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev had hoped that this would make him a much stronger leader. And of course, the biggest reason that Khrushchev always said was the reason for the missiles was to protect Cuba from further US invasions or threats to its security. Now, you also went through the 13 days of crisis and all the big events that caused the crisis to escalate. Now, you must remember that the first 7 days of the crisis involved the discovery of the missiles and Kennedy's time taken to listen to his advisors and decide what was the best course of action, whether he should go to war, invade Cuba, or consider diplomacy. It was only in the later 7 days of the crisis that we actually see the biggest amount of things happen. First, the US blockade happened on 22nd October, and this was quickly followed after with Khrushchev's letters. You must remember that Khrushchev sent 3 letters, but Kennedy only sent 1. The first letter that Khrushchev sent was rather aggressive on 23rd October, but he then later on sent 2 very, very conciliatory letters on 26th and 27th October, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a guarantee of Cuban independence and no invasion from the USA. Now, the most important and high tension point was also on the 27th of October when the US spy plane was shot down by the USSR. This was a very aggressive and almost threatening move that could have led to a full-blown war or nuclear holocaust. But the USA decided to let this episode go because they had been in the wrong to have sent a spy plane in the first place. And Khrushchev was very well aware that his generals had acted independently and not listened to his instructions to not shoot down any planes. This made him very worried that he could not trust his commanders on the ground. And that this was why he was more than ready to discuss a peaceful resolution with Kennedy. Now, of course, both leaders had to be very careful in how they managed this, and this was why on the last day of the crisis, 28th October, instead of the two leaders talking, they sent their best pals, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, and the Soviet ambassador to speak to each other to resolve the crisis. So you must understand some key terms that will often come out in the CMC. This could come out in your essay questions or even in your source-based articles. The concept of brinksmanship, going to the brink of war and risking something but not going to war in actual fact. Mutually assured destruction, the fact that both USA and USSR had equally potent nuclear missiles that could have destroyed each other. The concept of DEFCON levels, that the USA was at the second highest level of alert, that the next level would have just been war to begin with. And this was the highest level of nuclear war readiness that the country has ever been until today even. And of course, the two groups of people in the American camp, the Hawks, who wanted Kennedy to go to war, and the Doves, who wanted Kennedy to consider more peaceful diplomatic ways to resolve this crisis. So the crisis would end with 6 main impacts. The first one is that you must understand that both Kennedy and Khrushchev did win in the crisis. Kennedy managed to get the missiles removed from Cuba, and Khrushchev managed to achieve one of his biggest aims, which was for Cuba to maintain its independence and protect it from USA's possible invasion. Second of all, this very high-strung event led to a cooling down of relations in the Cold War in the late 1960s and 1970s. Third of all, this crisis also led to slightly greater cooperation between the USA and USSR, with the hotline being established between Moscow and Washington, so both leaders could discuss very important events directly and not through proxies. Now, the three other smaller events that you must understand is that because of the cooling down of relations, there was also a reduction in arms. There was no longer a huge race to produce the best and most prolific nuclear weapons, and some treaties were signed to actually limit the creation of nuclear weapons. However, you must understand that this was only in the late 60s and 1970s. In the 1980s, the arms race would restart again. Now, the two side effects that you must understand that happened after this crisis was that Khrushchev was now seen as a very weak leader by his people. People did not know that he had managed to secure USA's promise to remove the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. The reason why this was kept secret was because even the Americans did not know that they had missiles in Turkey, and the Turkish themselves did not know that the Turkish government had made a secret pact to allow US missiles there. As a result, this entire clause was kept secret. So nobody knew that the USA had also given up some missiles. As a result, Khrushchev lost popular vote and popular support in the USSR. He was forced into retirement the next year, 1963, and Brezhnev took over. Last of all, as you can imagine, Cuba was the most upset at the entire crisis and how they no longer had military superiority over the USA with the nuclear weapons, and the relationship between Cuba and the USSR was greatly strained after this. In fact, the next biggest communist country, China, was also rather alarmed at how the USSR had acted and felt that they had backed down too easily against the USA. This also strained Chinese and Soviet relations, and China and Cuba ended up becoming closer friends as they fell out with the USSR. So in summary, these are the four main areas that you must understand in a crisis: the reasons for the crisis, why the USSR placed missiles there, the events of the crisis, because this would be a very rich source of perspectives taking in a source-based question, and finally, the impact of the crisis and how this would actually affect the Cold War because of this 13-day crisis. Once you understand this, you have a very good understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis and will be well placed to understand all the events in this particular episode. Thank you.